If I asked you, what is the Great American Novel, a few titles might spring to mind. And if one of them is by Sarah J. Maas, this is not the video for you. I'm kidding. This is a safe space. But a lot of the titles that tend to come to mind when I ask that question might be The Great Gatsby, Moby Dick, Grapes of Wrath, Gone with the Wind, Little Women, Huckleberry Finn, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Bell Jar, Invisible Man, or The Catcher in the Rye. This concept, the Great American Novel, has been hotly debated in literature, in the media, and in academic papers. And so today I wanted to break it down and talk about the mythology surrounding the concept of the Great American Novel. Does it even really exist? And also how I think it is precisely that. A myth. It is mythology. Is it really possible for one person with one body of work to define the sensibilities of an entire nation, especially one as vast as America? Can they faithfully embody the entire ethos of a place so thoroughly? And ultimately, is it a uniquely American ambition to attempt to do so? Why do we even have the term, the Great American Novel? Well, it's interesting, right? Because this quest doesn't really exist anywhere else. Firstly, American is not a unique language, even if they do say trash instead of rubbish and let's do a school shooting drill instead of let's ban guns, and eggplant instead of aubergine. You know, it is Anglophone. It is fundamentally English, and yet writers like Jack Kerouac or Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman would all be considered to be American writers specifically. And I point this out because this concept doesn't really exist with other languages. So for example, Franz Kafka was Czech, and yet he is widely considered to be one of the great German writers because he wrote in German. And then likewise, you have people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is considered to be one of the great French writers, even though he was Swiss. And so the quest for a great American novel or a great American writer is a unique one. Looking through academic papers, there is no quest to find the great Armenian novel or the great Swedish novel, the great Bangladeshi novel, the great Colombian novel. As Ed Simons notes for Literary Hub, the idea of the great American novel makes little sense, since in terms of genre, American literature should be subsumed into the broader category of Anglophone. The great American novel is a manifestly strange idea, the fabulism that a single author in a single novel can somehow encompass the entirety of a country. America alone, among countries, has quixotically embraced such a concept. Ironic, for American literature itself, which is largely produced in English rather than a language called American, is itself a misnomer. So, why America? Well, I think as a starting point, it helps to think about the novel as the art form that it is. The world's very first novel is widely considered to be the Book of Genji, which was written 1,000 years ago in Japanese. But in the English-speaking world, Daniel Defoe is considered to be the father of the English novel, although I want to just put this on the record and say, if that man is the father of the English novel, I wish he had pulled out, because Moll Flanders nearly made me drop out of my literature degree in week 1. We have personal beef. Robinson Crusoe, pretty good though. Robinson Crusoe and Moll Flanders were published in 1719 and 1722, respectively. However, I would like to point out that modern scholars actually recognise Aphra Behn as one of the first English novelists who was publishing in the 1680s, so about 40 years earlier. 10 points if you can guess why she is often erased from the conversation. She's a woman. It's misogyny. There we go. And you will notice that the dismissal of female novel writing becomes a bit of a trend in the conversation around novels, but specifically the great American novel as well. It's exhausting. I'm sorry in advance. All this to say, the English novel as we know it originates around the time of the 17th century. You know what else originates around the time of the 17th century? Modern America. America as we know it today. And this is where I want to, of course, acknowledge that America was colonized, and the indigenous Native American people inhabited the land long before it was discovered. 98% of ancestral homeland has been lost, and there was a population decrease of Native American people of 96%. That's from the years 1492 to 1900. I can't in good faith make this video without pointing that out. And so when I'm referring to America, I'm talking about America in its current iteration. And if you're looking for brilliant Native American writing, I would highly recommend the work of Tommy Orange. They're There and Wandering Stars are absolutely exquisite, and I highly, highly recommend. And so when I'm referring referring to America in this video, I'm referring to the history of the present-day United States, which begins in 1607 with the establishment of Jamestown in modern-day Virginia. And then, of course, the Declaration of Independence in 1776, which codified America, the United States, as separate from Great Britain. So my point here is that most modern nations existed long before the genesis of the novel as an art form, but America's history kind of coincides with it. The United States, as we know it, was established within the lifetime of the novel, which I suppose makes it feel like more of a realistic goal, more of a manageable, doable thing, that a novel could embody the entire ethos of what America is and the American sentiment, the American sensibility. This, I think, is why the notion of there being one singular great American novel even exists in the first place. So, we've spoken about America's political history. How about its cultural history? Calls for an autonomous national literature started around the time of the American Revolution. But in 1820, Sidney Smith asserted, literature, the Americans have none. No native literature, we mean. It is all imported. Which, ironically, is the read of the century. Imagine someone saying that your defining character trait is that you have no character traits. Your defining personality is the absence of one. And thus begins the quest for something uniquely American, America's cultural output. Almost 50 years later, in 1868, a writer called John William DeForest proposed a collective artistic project for the nation. The challenge was to create a work of fiction that accomplished the task of painting the American soul. The goal was, and I quote, to capture the ordinary emotions and manners of American existence. No biggie. No pressure, no stress. How hard can it be, right? Well, it turns out pretty hard. And thus commenced the quest for the Great American Novel. This was a term that DeForest coined himself, the Great American Novel. It was later shortened to GAN by Henry James. And interestingly, John William DeForest noted that he thought the Great American Novel actually had not been written yet at the time of writing. This was something that was yet to be achieved. He did, however, point out, kind of shout out one book that he thought was the closest they had come to finding the Great American Novel. And that book was Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which he said was the closest novel to embodying the vision that he imagined. It's an anti-slave novel about a noble slave who saves the life of a young girl. DeForest also pointed out, as I did before, that there is no desire to find a great American poem, for example, because this art form was considered to be too antiquated for the young nation's sensibility. The new country needed a new art form to define it, a contemporary art form, the novel. In his book, The Dream of the Great American Novel, Lawrence Buell notes how the publication of this essay coincided with the rising prominence of the novel. Like, up to this point, only around 5% of books published in America referred to themselves as novels. Most considered themselves to be tales. Another point, I suppose, and maybe cynics would argue this, is that the concept of the Great American Novel is symptomatic of the concept of American exceptionalism. American patriotism is riddled with phrases like land of the free, the greatest country in the world, leaders of the free world, even make America great again, implies some innate greatness in the American soul, the American soil, pledging allegiance to the flag at school, singing the Star-Spangled Banner. Speaking anecdotally, spending a lot of time in the US over the last few years, it actually surprised me as a young person just how patriotic other young people were in America and how embedded into the culture perceived American exceptionalism is. Like, even just in casual conversation, the most kind of liberal lefty people you know will talk about how exceptional America is. And, you know, it's not without evidence. Data from the International Monetary Fund finds that the United States is the world's richest country. And even right now, as we speak, we are seeing the impact of America's influence on the international stage in global conflict. I think that part of the reason for this is due to America's geography, its location, and its size. These facets have proven advantageous in terms of resources, no risk of invasion, really. And it's also worth noting that America has fought most of its wars on foreign soil. With the exception of Pearl Harbor and 9/11, of course, America has faced very little destruction on its own shores, as opposed to the widespread destruction in countries like Vietnam, Japan, Korea, Germany, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran. IFS reports that the US and Allied air forces have dropped more than 337,000 bombs and missiles on other countries. That's an average of 46 strikes per day for 20 years. In 2016 alone, the US dropped 26,171 bombs on 7 countries, according to an analysis by the Council of Foreign Relations. My point is, America hasn't really had to rebuild since its conception. It has never had to rebuild its infrastructure from scratch because it was literally bombed. And so this has given it an opportunity for uninterrupted growth in terms of both economy and culture. I think those are important things to consider when we're having this conversation. So, we have spoken about why the concept exists, why this idea of greatness is kind of innate to the American people. Now, what makes a great American novel? Julia Keller wrote in the Chicago Tribune, not the best novel written by an American, rather, the best novel written by an American that most clearly reflects the spirit, character, and destiny of America, both its good and bad sides, its mistakes and its triumphs. It's more than a game, of course. Selecting a novel that encapsulates a nation's soul is a sneaky means of interrogating your deep beliefs about the place, your prejudices, and your expectations. According to Grant Shreve, it must achieve 4 things. Number 1, it must encompass the entire nation and not be too consumed with a particular region. For example, a book like Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver is so brilliant. It's such a great character description and a portrait of a person, but it is very closely tied to Appalachia and that region, so it maybe wouldn't qualify here. Number 2, it must be democratic in spirit and form. Number 3, its author must have been born in the United States or have adopted the country as his or her own. There is a lot of discussion about whether Nabokov and Lolita could be considered the great American novel, because Vladimir Nabokov was Russian but immigrated to the United States in the 1940s and then became a naturalized US citizen in 1945. Though the beginning of Lolita takes place in Europe, most of the novel is set in the United States. So could this novel qualify? It's kind of been a hotly debated topic. And the 4th part of the criteria is that its true cultural worth must not be recognized upon its publication. So now this brings me on to talking about a handful of individual contenders. But before I do, I wanted to talk about something that I think is great, and that is the sponsor of today's video, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one platform for building a website or an online brand. And the best news is you don't need to be a coding expert. You don't need to have a degree in computer science. Squarespace actually has hundreds of incredible templates which you can use to customize and create something that's completely your own. You can bring your vision to life using a range of different features, for example, the ability to create a blog, an email sign-up list, your customers can have flexible payments, and there's also AI SEO. So once you've created your website, you can make sure that people can actually find it on search engines. And so all of your hard work goes to good use. And with Squarespace, you always put your best foot forward. If this all sounds good to you, you can head to squarespace.com right now for a free trial, and then use my code jackedwards at squarespace.com/jackedwards to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, and now let's talk about The Great Gatsby. Come on, this book even has the word great in the title. It seems to fit all of the above criteria, and I think it is probably one of the first books that comes to mind when we talk about the question of the great American novel. Maureen Corrigan wrote this amazing book called So We Read On, How the Great Gatsby Came to Be and Why It Endures. This book reveals that actually the Great Gatsby ticks all of the criteria, including the final one, because I didn't actually realize this, but Fitzgerald's books were out of print by the time of his death. And actually, Zelda Fitzgerald, his widow, was left to work tables at a restaurant to make ends meet. According to the Washington Post, the last royalty check he received from Scribner's was for $13.13. And apparently, those royalties just came from books the author himself had purchased. It's giving when you like your own Instagram post, you know? In May 1940, he wrote this to his editor: "I wish I was in print. It will be odd a year or so from now when Scotty assures her friends I was an author and finds that no book is procurable. Would the 25-cent press keep Gatsby in the public eye, or is the book unpopular? Has it had its chance?" Which breaks my heart a little bit. However, the novel received a boost during the Second World War when the government kind of had this campaign to send books out to soldiers on the front line. They would ship compact paperbacks to soldiers to read in their downtime, and Gatsby was one of the books that was selected. The Armed Services Edition sent out 155,000 copies of Gatsby and sort of cemented its legacy. Soon it was being taught in schools, and it kind of got a second lease of life. So let's see how Corrigan makes the case for Gatsby as the great American novel. Gatsby's magic emanates not only from its powerhouse poetic style, in which ordinary American language becomes unearthly, but from the authority with which it nails who we want to be as Americans. Not who we are, who we want to be. It's that wanting that runs through every page of Gatsby, making it our great American novel. But it's also our easiest great American novel to underrate. Too short, too tempting to misread as just a love story gone wrong, too mired in the roaring 20s, and all that jazz. Gatsby explores the pursuit and ultimate failure of the American dream. And what the American dream really embodies and means is that there is a game that everyone in America plays, but nobody wins. It's often misused or misquoted. I also talk about this in the context of the term nostalgia, which was used in Homer's Odyssey, not just to refer to reminiscing on the past with kind of rose-tinted glasses, but thinking about a home that you can no longer return to. That's the crucial tension there. It is something you know in your heart you will never return to. That's the ethos of nostalgia. And I think that the American dream is also sometimes misused by optimists to suggest the hopefulness of America and the fact that this is a country where anyone can achieve anything that they want, that it's a meritocracy, that the harder you work, the better your outcomes. That's not really what the American dream was actually invented as a term to explain. In fact, the phrase was invented to describe a failure, not a promise, a broken promise, really. It's a promise that was made, but inevitably falters and falls short. That's the crucial tension within the concept of the American dream. The term was actually popularized in the early years of the Great Depression, and it described the way that individual people struggled against the capitalist system. This system overwhelmed them, but ultimately just disappointed them. That's what the American dream truly is, and I think that Gatsby embodies that. Here's an iconic quote from the very ending of the novel. I have my beaten up old copy right here. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, so we beat on. Boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. So that's Gatsby, but what about another contender, Moby Dick? To totally simplify this absolute tome of a book, this doorstop of a book, Moby Dick is about a boat called the Pequod, and the crew on that boat go on a hunt for a white whale called Moby Dick. The book is told from the perspective of Ishmael, the ship's lone survivor, and mostly centers on Ahab, the ship's obstinate and vengeful captain. He convinces everyone to hunt for the whale, leading to their tragic, untimely death. I'm sorry that is a bit of a spoiler, but the book has been out for 174 years. You've had time. I guess the question is, does that inscrutable and evasive white whale represent our human search for meaning? You know, within the murkiness, does it describe our desire to be masters over nature? Are we ultimately reminded by Herman Melville that this is an unachievable goal, that the white whale will inevitably elude us? The book, I think, also critiques individualistic society. This was something that at the time was being introduced and celebrated by writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson. It was this philosophy of self-reliance, which I think a lot of individualistic American culture is based on. But ultimately we watch as Ahab's egoism and his obsessiveness ultimately causes his demise. Whereas Emerson celebrated the possibilities of the self, Melville warns of the destructive nature of an exaggerated sense of self-reliance and self-regard. This is a quote from Chris Hedges. Melville makes our murderous obsessions, our hubris, violent impulses, moral weakness, and inevitable self-destruction visible in his chronicle of a whaling voyage. Melville's description of the ship's captain, Ahab, is a description of the bankers, corporate boards, politicians, television personalities, and generals who, through the power of propaganda, fill our heads with seductive images of glory and lust for wealth and power. We are consumed with self-induced obsessions that spur us toward self-annihilation. And I think that's why the book has had such continued success and relevance and pertinence, because it continues to act as a kind of prophecy. Though it went out of print initially in Melville's lifetime, so big tick to the irrelevant point on the checklist. Irrelevant at time of publication, I will add. But it has proven itself to be sort of perennial. In 2018, after Trump's first election, the Los Angeles Times published an article called "Want to Better Understand the Trump Presidency? Give Moby Dick another read." Stephen Armand notes how Melville is offering a mythic account of how one man's virile bombast ensnares everyone and everything it encounters. The setting is nautical, the language epic, but the tale, stripped to its ribs, is about the seductive power of the wounded male ego, how naturally a ship steered by men might tack to its vengeful course. In this analogy, Trump is Ahab. He is the captain of the ship, and the American people, or specifically Trump's voters, are the crew. People have historically used Moby Dick to talk about the ways that leaders have dragged their countries into wars they had no business being in, or enacted policies that divide us rather than unite us, these self-destructive policies. And so the book has taken on this kind of mythical quality and become a sacred text in American culture. Philip Hoare for The New Yorker said this: "In an age of uncertain faith, then as now, Moby Dick resembles a religious tract, an alternative testament. It reads like something that was written before books were invented, yet it is utterly modern, pre-postmodern, perhaps. It is part of its own prediction, as if it and its characters had been there all along, and had only been waiting to be written." That's the case for Moby Dick. I think that my personal contribution to this discourse is East of Eden by John Steinbeck. To me, that is the closest we have to the great American novel. I truly think it's one of the best books ever written in general, and I recommend it so thoroughly. Ultimately, it's a parable based on the biblical tale of Cain and Abel. It spans from the American Civil War to the First World War, and I think that Steinbeck explores the essence of good and evil. He states, "We have only one story. All novels, all poetry are built on the never-ending contest in ourselves of good and evil." It's a big claim, you know, and I think it has some truth to it too. And for a title competing of the accolade of the great American novel, you know, you have to speak to some sort of universal truth. And although this book takes place in the Salinas Valley in California, I do think that it speaks to a wider sensibility, which we've established is kind of the criteria here. It's so expertly crafted. Steinbeck makes you care about every single character, even when they make mistakes. But it's also stood the test of time, maintaining its relevance. Nick Hilden notes how Steinbeck describes how the American people, having forgotten the horrors of previous wars, looked to enter the First World War with somewhat excited trepidation. It was only after telegrams began arriving with the names of dead soldiers that reality bit down, and the hunger for such foreign adventures began to wane. This has been a terrible circumstance that we've seen play out again and again, perhaps most notably in the cases of Vietnam and the Iraq and Afghanistan wars of the 2000s. And now we're seeing it again as the public weighs the pros and cons of a war with Iran. Steinbeck makes no specific judgments on the American amnesia towards past conflicts and our propensity to embrace new ones. But he does point out that our early patriotic enthusiasm tends to wane as the body bags come home to tearful families. Ultimately, I think Steinbeck reminds us of a fundamental truth that goes all the way back to the Bible. He says, "But the Hebrew word, the word timshul, thou mayest, that gives a choice. It may be the most important word in the world that says the way is open, that throws it right back on a man. For if thou mayest, it is also true that thou mayest not." And yet, it is also worth noting how deeply white and male this conversation generally tends to be. Viet Thanh Nguyen said that one of the unspoken silences of the great American novel is the assumption that it can only be written by white men. And Gertrude Stein, too, once lamented that because she was a lesbian Jewish woman, she would never get to write the great American novel. Joyce Carol Oates similarly felt that a woman could write it, but then it wouldn't be the great American novel. So is this concept of greatness not only a uniquely American endeavor, but also a masculine one? Ursula Kain, the fantastic sci-fi writer, notes how greatness, in the sense of outstanding or unique accomplishment, is a crypto-gendered word. In ordinary usage and common understanding, a great American means a great American man. A great writer means a great male writer. To regender the word, it must modify a feminine noun, a great American woman, a great woman writer. To degender it, it must be used in a locution such as great Americans or writers, both men and women. Greatness in the abstract, in general, is still thought of as the province of men. I just think Ursula Kain expressed this so brilliantly, so I wanted to read this quote in full, because I think she really gets to the crux and the core of why other writers aren't considered part of this conversation when they aren't white or male, due to not starting on a level playing field. If most white men already perceive themselves to be in some way great, they kind of have nothing to prove in that regard. Now they can just focus on making a great piece of art as well. And so she says this: "The writer who sets out to write the great American novel must see himself as a free citizen of that province, competing on equal ground with other writers, living and dead, for a glittering prize, a unique honor. His career is a contest, a battle, with victory over other men as its goal. He is unlikely to think much about women as competitors. Only in this view of the writer, as a fully privileged male, a warrior, literature as a tournament, greatness as the defeat of others, can the idea of the great American novel exist." So could Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar or Toni Morrison's Beloved be considered the great American novel? Even Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, I think, is a definite contender. In 2006, the New York Times Book Review conducted a survey where authors were asked to nominate the single best work of American fiction published in the last 25 years, and Beloved came out on top. Pakistani writer Mohsin Hamid took more issue with the parochial nature of the quest, the American quest. And he suggested that the great American novel is actually indicative of insecurity, and it's a product of colonial legacy. Maybe the truest American story is the story of immigration. Firstly, because America is a land built on immigration, but secondly, maybe because only someone coming to America can truly hold up a mirror to America and show the people who they are, what they are. So then perhaps the great American novel is Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, where she says, "I didn't realize I was black until I came to America." Maybe that gets to the crux of some sort of universal truth of what it is to experience America. What about the book Dominicana by Angie Cruz, which is a portrait of the immigrant experience? I also just read The Emperor of Gladness by Ocean Vuong, and I think maybe that's a contender too. It's a story of community and struggle and plight and the things we can do for one another, but also it doesn't promise any of its characters a happy ending. Maybe that speaks to a more universal truth. And that book is written by a first-generation immigrant. Or is this conversation just futile to begin with, you know? Is it even worth us talking about the great American novel? A.O. Scott once proposed that the great American novel was just a myth, likening its existence to urban legends and conspiracies. The great American novel, while also a hybrid, crossbred of romance and reportage, high philosophy and low gossip, wishful thinking and hard-nosed skepticism, may be more like the Yeti, or the Loch Ness Monster, or Sasquatch, if we want to keep things homegrown. It is, in other words, a creature that quite a few people, not all of them certifiably crazy, some of them bearing impressive documentation, claim to have seen. By the 1970s, the very concept of the great American novel was starting to be dismissed. In a review of a new Frank Norris book, the New York Times noted that the great American novel was kind of like a sea serpent. They said that the great American novel is not extinct like the dodo, but mythical like the hippogriff. It wasn't just that modern novelists couldn't achieve the great American novel, it was that the concept never really worked to begin with. By the mid-20th century, people were starting to suggest that this was an amateurish thing to sort of even aim for. In his 1972 Esquire essay, Why They Aren't Writing the Great American Novel Anymore, Tom Wolfe went so far as to say that authors had lost all interest in the thing. Most serious American novelists would rather cut their wrists than be known as the secretary of American society. Who wants such a menial role? Instead, he said that journalists should be chronicling the times and artists should just be making art. I think at this point, the commentary started to drift to whether anyone can ever truly define a generation or a community, a country, a nationality. Tony Tahalotamaiti wrote this incredible article for the New York Times called Why There's No Millennial Novel. And in that he says, there's nothing wrong with wanting to see yourself reflected in a book, and there's nothing about novels like mine that prevent people from doing so. But the desire to universalize that feeling and declare that any book speaks for everyone ends up shortchanging both the novel and the generation. So maybe the concept of the great American novel is our own white whale. Perhaps it is this thing that we are chasing that ultimately just destroys us. There's no reason to be doing so. Maybe the great American novel is the green light that Gatsby sees at the end of Daisy's Pier. Is it really possible for one body of work by one person to define an entire nation's sensibilities? That is the question that we keep coming back to. Back to Ursula K. Le Guin, who says, art is not a horse race. Literature is not the Olympics. The hell with the great American novel. We have all the great novels we need right now. And right now, some man or woman is writing a new one we won't know we needed till we read it. I don't know if one single novel could truly be the definitive great American novel. Maybe the promise or the prospect of the great American novel is kind of just like the prospect or the promise of the American dream, you know? It's not a promise, it's a broken promise. It is something we ultimately will fail. Or maybe the fun is in the chase. Maybe the fun is in the discussion around it. Maybe this is just fodder for listicles. Maybe something will eventually be written, which will be the great American novel. I don't know, but I would love to know your thoughts in the description down below. Thank you so much for listening to me yap about this. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. I hope that it was thought-provoking in some way. And don't forget, you can follow me over on TikTok and Instagram. You can subscribe if you're new. I also have a second channel, Jack in the Books. And I have something very exciting coming very soon called Inklings. And if you'd like to be involved in that, you can follow at ____inklings ____ over on Instagram. It's a private account right now, but I will let you in. I'm sitting there approving everyone's follow requests, and I'm very excited to have you all on board. It's my new baby that I've been working on for a very long time, and I would love to have you on board for many more of these conversations in the future. So thank you for watching. All the best. Stay in touch. Have the most wonderful day, and I will catch you very soon. Bye-bye.